The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to allow an executive order restricting mail-in voting to take effect, setting up a high-stakes legal showdown just months before the November midterm elections. On Monday, Solicitor General D. John Sauer filed an emergency application asking the justices to intervene after a federal appeals court on Saturday blocked key parts of President Trump's executive order. Sauer called the lower court ruling indefensible and said it imposed serious irreparable harm on the federal government by barring federal agencies from implementing an order he described as promoting election integrity in the upcoming federal elections in November. The executive order, signed by President Trump in late March, attempted to place limits on mail-in voting. It would use federal oversight of the U.S. Postal Service to gain greater control over mail-in voting practices. Specifically, the order directed the Department of Homeland Security to create state-by-state citizen lists to help determine voter eligibility, and then called on the Postal Service to use lists provided by states to decide if voters should be allowed to vote by mail. More than 20 Democratic attorneys general challenged the order in court. They argued it violated several provisions of the Constitution, including the separation of powers, by having the executive branch take control of functions usually regulated by Congress and the states. The Supreme Court has asked the challengers to respond to the government's emergency application by Monday, August 3, giving the parties only a few days to brief the issue. President Trump has repeatedly criticized mail-in voting and sought restrictions on it for years, making unfounded claims sowing doubt about voting by mail and claiming it allows widespread fraud. So far, federal courts have stymied many of his efforts to restrict mail voting. In late June, a federal judge in Massachusetts, Indira Talwani, issued a ruling blocking key parts of the executive order. Judge Talwani concluded that the Constitution does not grant the president any specific powers over elections, and she underlined the words "does not." This past weekend, a three-judge panel from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit upheld her decision. The judges wrote that if the president's order were allowed to go into effect for the midterm elections in November, it would sow confusion and threaten disenfranchisement of many eligible voters. The Constitution gives the states and Congress primary authority over election administration, and this case now sits before the Supreme Court on an expedited timeline. The case centers on a fundamental constitutional question: whether the president has authority to regulate elections, or whether that power rests with the states and Congress. With the midterms approaching, the Supreme Court's decision on this emergency application could determine the rules for mail-in voting nationwide. This reporting comes from Abby Van Sickle of the New York Times, reporting from Washington. We'll continue to follow developments. Thanks for listening.